room with a secret prison recording and proof of a fake company he still controls. His empire collapses on live TV, his allies abandon him mid-hearing, and federal prosecutors move in. What did Jasmine reveal that turned Wall Street's coldest villain into a national disgrace before the cameras even stopped rolling? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. U.S. Capitol, March 2026. The rotunda echoed with restless murmurs as camera lenses narrowed in on room 2141, where a single name was written on every tongue: Jasmine Crockett. Appointed chair of the most anticipated congressional hearing in a decade, she sat at the center of a storm that had been brewing for years. Across the country, more than 40 million Americans watched live, many clutching their prescription bottles like lifelines, waiting for justice, retribution, or at least an answer to why life-saving medications cost more than life itself. The hearing was titled Restructuring Big Pharma After the Pandemic, but it might as well have been named The Reckoning. Every chair was filled, security was doubled, reporters were stationed shoulder to shoulder, and the room carried the silent weight of lives lost, families bankrupted, futures delayed, all while pharmaceutical stocks soared. And then, the doors opened. Martin Shkreli stepped in. He walked like he never left. Black suit, silver tie, smug smirk, the kind that had once made him the face of greed in modern medicine. But this time, he wasn't the puppet master. He was the defendant. Fresh out of prison, summoned for his new role as CEO of a shadowy biotech startup, already accused of manipulating AI-driven insurance algorithms to deny coverage for experimental cancer treatments. His new company had tripled insulin prices within a month and buried the data behind firewalls coded to exploit Medicaid loopholes. But today, those firewalls were cracking. Jasmine Crockett didn't rise from her seat. She didn't have to. The gavel in her hand was heavier than before, not just by metal, but by the burden of every American family shattered by profit-driven pills. She looked up slowly, her eyes locked with Shkreli's, and with a single line, she detonated the silence. Mr. Shkreli, did you learn anything at all from the prison cell you walked out of? Or did you just build a new one, this time for the rest of us? The room froze. The chamber held its breath, waiting for shame or remorse. But Shkreli didn't flinch. He smiled and walked straight into the fire like he lit it himself. If Jasmine Crockett's question pierced the silence like a blade, Shkreli responded not with regret, but with a rehearsed smile, a clicker in hand, and a presentation titled like a warning, The Free Market, Why It Must Hurt to Heal. He strode to the center like a lecturer preparing to enlighten the misinformed. Behind him, a screen lit up with a minimalist slide, stark white letters on black, reading $750 is not a crime. The boldness of it felt like a slap to every struggling parent watching from a hospital waiting room. He didn't even glance at the panel. He was performing, for the cameras, for the markets, maybe even for himself. Let's be clear, he began, adjusting the microphone with a calmness that made it worse. If someone pays $750 for a drug, it means the drug has value. It means they wanted it. That's not extortion. That's economics. The words hung in the air like smoke after a controlled burn. Clean, technical, detached from the charred remains beneath. He clicked to the next slide, a chart tracking supposed R&D investment growth alongside increasing drug prices. But there were no patient names. No mention of the 7-year-old diabetic whose mother started a GoFundMe at midnight. No asterisks for the elderly man who'd cut pills in half to stretch a prescription. Just graphs, numbers, and margins. Without profit, he said coolly, there is no progress. You can't demand a cure for cancer and also demand socialism. Someone has to pay the bill. He paused, let the silence stretch, then added with deliberate disdain, and let's not pretend the problem is us. The real issue is a generation raised to expect rescue, from government checks, from subsidies, from bailouts. The welfare system doesn't empower people. It erodes them. A slow stir moved through the chamber. Crockett didn't speak. Not yet. She didn't need to. The room was already starting to pulse with something raw. Because what Shkreli was offering wasn't just a defense. It was an ideology that traded human suffering for financial sustainability. He called it innovation. but to the millions watching live, millions who'd skipped treatments, drained savings, buried loved ones, it felt more like a confession without the guilt. He wasn't hiding it. He was daring the world to accept it. And for Jasmine Crockett, seated in the eye of that storm, it was clear. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a moral crucible. Shkreli's final word landed like a stone in still water, smug, polished, and deeply hollow. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She understood something he didn't. Real power doesn't rush. It waits. She didn't respond. Not right away. Instead, she let the room sit in the echo of his last sentence, watching him with the quiet intensity of someone who'd seen this game before, played by different men in different suits, but always with the same cruelty wrapped in confidence. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, but her body remained still, grounded, controlled. It wasn't silence born of uncertainty. It was strategy, because she knew something was unfolding, and the more he talked, the more he revealed. She didn't need to attack. She needed him to keep digging. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the stillness like a scalpel. "Mr. Shkreli," she said slowly, "before we go any further, could you define for this committee what ethics means in the context of pharmaceutical practice?" She emphasized the word ethics, not market value, not return on investment. Ethics. And in that moment, the power shifted. Not because she shouted, but because she reminded everyone in the room. This was never just about numbers. It was about who we are when profit meets pain. Outside the Capitol, the air was electric. Protesters, some hoarse from chanting, others silent in grim solidarity, lined the barricades. They held signs like shields. Justice over profit. Insulin is not a luxury. Patience, not price tags. Some were parents, some were patients. Many had lost someone. The crowd wasn't just watching, they were pleading. Pleading with a system that had failed them too many times to count. Every word said in that hearing was being broadcast in real time to a public that no longer trusted the institutions designed to protect them. They weren't asking for handouts. They were asking for humanity. And inside the chamber, Jasmine Crockett, unshaken, deliberate, was doing something rare in American politics. She was listening, not to power, but to pain. Shkreli began to respond, his mouth opening with the ease of a man used to deflecting truth. But Jasmine Crockett didn't let him finish. She raised her hand, calm and precise, and said only one sentence. "We're going to let the country decide what ethics looks like." The lights dimmed. The screen behind her lit up, not with graphs or slogans, but with a single unpolished video clip. No dramatic music, no narration, just a boy. His name was Elijah. He was 13. His hospital gown hung loose around his shoulders. A nasal cannula fed oxygen through his nose. He spoke in broken breaths, his voice barely audible. "They told us there's a pill," he said, pausing to breathe, "but we don't have that kind of money." The camera panned slightly. His mother was beside him, holding his hand with the quiet desperation of someone who's already begged every hotline, every nonprofit, every elected office she could reach. "They said Daraprim used to be $20, she said, eyes locked on the camera. "But after the price change, it was hundreds per pill." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her stillness was more devastating than any scream. The clip lasted less than a minute. When the screen went black, the silence it left behind felt heavier than any testimony that had come before it. No one moved, no one dared. Even the cameras, usually quick to scan the room, stayed fixed on Jasmine. She turned slowly towards Shkreli, her face unreadable, but her voice unwavering. "That," she said, "is what the market calls efficiency." Her words were sharp but controlled, not theatrical, not angry, just devastating in their truth. "You called it innovation. You called it strategy. But what I see is a child who was priced out of his own life." Across the room, lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down. Others looked directly at Shkreli, who sat frozen, the smugness now drained into something closer to shame, or perhaps fear. Because for the first time, the numbers he had worshipped were no longer on a spreadsheet. They had a face, a name, a heartbeat. And that heartbeat was fading because of him. As the last haunting image of Elijah dissolved into darkness, the silence that followed didn't feel like the end of a clip. It felt like a room gasping for breath. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move to comfort. She moved to confront. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for theatrics. Instead, with the precision of a surgeon making the first incision, she opened the black folder resting beside her gavel. Her fingers moved slowly, methodically, pulling out a single printed email, a plain sheet of paper but heavy with something far more damning than any chart Shkreli had shown. This, she began, lifting the document just enough for the camera to catch, is an internal email from Mr. Shkreli's company, dated 3 weeks after the price increase on Daraprim. Her voice was calm, but the courtroom leaned forward instinctively, as if preparing for impact. Then she read it aloud, slowly, clearly. Let's milk this one. They have no choice. The words didn't land like a bomb. They landed like a betrayal. A quiet, brutal kind. The kind you feel in the gut, not the ears. They, she repeated, gaze fixed on Shkreli, being patients with compromised immune systems. Children, the dying, people who couldn't survive without that drug. The sentence hung in the air, not as a quote, but as a confession. And your company didn't discuss how to help them. You discussed how to squeeze them, because they couldn't say no. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Because this wasn't just about one executive or one price hike. It was about a system where a child's body could be reduced to a market opportunity. And someone somewhere wrote that sentence with no hesitation. Around the room, even the most hardened political veterans shifted in their seats. A few lowered their eyes. The phrase repeated itself silently across every mind in the chamber. They have no choice. It was not strategy. It was exploitation, laid out in plain text. And Jasmine didn't move on quickly. She let it breathe, let it burn. Because this wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about translating suffering into language that could no longer be ignored. The words from the email, "They have no choice," still hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Jasmine set the page down gently, letting the silence stretch. Not as a pause, but as a judgment. And into that silence, Martin Shkreli spoke. It was quiet, so quiet you could hear a pen drop in the back row. No gavel struck. No one dared breathe too loudly. The entire hearing room, packed with lawmakers, aides, press, and history itself, had become still. And then, in a moment that would be replayed across news networks and social media for weeks, Martin Shkreli smirked. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice low and disturbingly calm. "That's business," he said. Just 2 words. But in those 2 words was everything that had gone wrong. Everything millions of Americans already feared but had never heard said aloud. Not with this level of contempt, not in this place. He wasn't denying the accusation. He was validating it. The boy who couldn't breathe, the mother who couldn't pay. To him, they weren't tragedies. They were transactions. A few gasps broke through the silence. One senator's hand dropped from his face as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. A reporter in the back lowered her camera, stunned. But Jasmine didn't react. Not with shock, not with rage. She sat completely still, staring straight at him, her expression carved from something colder than anger. Clarity. Because in that moment, she understood, and everyone else did too, that this wasn't about one man. It wasn't about one drug, one scandal, or even one broken company. It was about a culture, a system, one that had allowed profit to become so normalized, so sacred that a child's death could be dismissed as just another entry in a ledger. And now the man who helped design it had said the quiet part out loud, not by accident, by instinct. Because to him, ethics had no margin, only profit did. Shkreli's words, "That's business," still echoed in the chamber like a threat dressed in a shrug. But Jasmine Crockett didn't look shocked. She looked ready. And when she spoke, the air changed. She leaned forward, not with fury, but with clarity, the kind that doesn't rise to meet arrogance, but cuts straight through it. Her voice didn't waver. It didn't rise. but every syllable was made of steel. Economic freedom, she said slowly, deliberately, does not mean strangling the poor to make the rich richer. The line didn't echo. It landed. Heavy, final. You could feel it in the room, the shift from theater to reckoning. Lawmakers sat straighter. Reporters dropped their pens. The audience outside, watching on massive screens, erupted into stunned silence. You say that's business like it's a shield, she continued, eyes locked on Shkreli now. But when your business model is built on people who can't say no, when it depends on a mother choosing between medicine and groceries, that's not innovation. It's extortion. Her voice tightened, not with anger, but with something deeper. Conviction born from seeing this cruelty up close. She didn't need charts. She didn't need applause. She had one weapon, the truth spoken plainly. What you call capitalism, she said, has become a system of quiet violence, where those who suffer the most are told they should be grateful the market noticed them at all. She paused just long enough to let that truth settle. Shkreli said nothing. His smirk was gone, and the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was accountability. Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to argue price points. She came to draw a line between policy and morality, and to say without blinking that some lines are not meant to be crossed in the name of profit. Not now. Not ever. The chamber was still reeling from Jasmine Crockett's last statement, a silence loaded with truth, too sharp to ignore. But Martin Shkreli, as always, mistook the stillness for weakness. And so, he smirked and spoke. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded like a schoolboy caught lying but too proud to care. Why not just give the drugs away for free then? He said, loud enough for the cameras, his tone oozing mockery. Maybe we can all hold hands and heal each other with kindness. A few chuckles, awkward, forced, from the back benches. But the room didn't laugh. It flinched. Because it wasn't just sarcasm, it was contempt. For patients, for families, for the entire hearing itself. The question wasn't genuine. It was a shield, a dare, a tactic used by profiteers when they're no longer able to defend the harm they cause. But Jasmine Crockett had heard it before, from CEOs, from bankers, from lobbyists in more expensive suits. And this time, she wasn't going to let it stand. She sat forward, her tone sharp, not theatrical, but precise. You mean the HIV vaccine you invested in? She asked, locking eyes with him. The room snapped to attention. The one developed by American researchers with taxpayer-funded grants? The one you quietly sold the patent rights for, to a biotech firm with direct ties to Beijing? Her voice didn't rise, but the accusation sliced like cold steel. Let me ask you something, Mr. Shkreli, she continued, letting each word fall with surgical precision. Was that the result of financial hardship? Or was it betrayal disguised as business? Then she said it, flat and clear. Was that poverty or was that treason? A hush swept the room, not from fear, but from recognition. Because this wasn't just about pricing or profit anymore. It was about selling the keys to American breakthroughs to foreign hands while preaching loyalty in the name of capitalism. Shkreli's grin faltered, only slightly, but enough. Enough for the room to feel it. Enough for the public to see through it. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a lawmaker asking a question. She was the voice of a country tired of being told that betrayal is just the cost of doing business. Just when the chamber thought the worst had been revealed, Jasmine Crockett reached beneath her stack of notes and calmly pressed a small button. And with that, the hearing crossed a line it could never return from. A faint hiss emerged from the speakers. Then, unmistakably, his voice. Martin Shkreli. Confident. Unapologetic. The recording was dated just 6 months before his release from prison, but his tone wasn't that of a man reflecting or remorseful. It was triumphant, calculated. They think they've shut me down, he said, laughing, casual like someone boasting at a bar. I'll be back in the game before they even notice. Set up a shell, maybe in Delaware or offshore. Put it in someone else's name. Play it clean on paper. Dirty underneath. That's the game. And I know how to win it. His voice was unguarded, not because he didn't care, but because he was convinced no one would ever hear it. But now 40 million Americans were. Every word broadcast live. Inside the room, it was as if the oxygen had been vacuumed out. Lawmakers leaned in. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. And Shkreli? He sat rigid, no longer smirking. The color in his face dulled, not from shock, but from the sudden realization that he was no longer ahead of the game. Jasmine let the tape continue for a few seconds longer, enough to let him finish describing how dumb it is that people still think names on paper mean anything, and how he had 3 guys at Ivy League schools willing to sign whatever for a few $1,000s. When she hit pause, the silence didn't feel like silence. It felt like judgment. Without breaking eye contact, she reached into a folder and slid out a single sheet, a visual diagram of Helix Biocorp's ownership structure. It looked like a spider web of subsidiaries, offshore filings, nominee directors, and borrowed names. But at the center, traced in red ink, was a quiet trust, registered in Wyoming, linked to a dormant foundation, with Martin Shkreli's handwriting on the incorporation papers. It wasn't just circumstantial, it was direct. "This is your company," Jasmine said flatly, holding the document high so the cameras could catch every name. "You said it wasn't. You said you were just consulting. But your voice, your signature, and your money say otherwise. You didn't just break the rules, you rewrote them so no one would notice when you did." The tension in the room snapped like a cable under pressure. One aide dropped a pen. Another congressman quietly whispered to his counsel. And then came the moment no one had expected. Representative Thomas Varnell, a senior Republican known for his vocal defense of deregulated biotech, slowly rose from his seat. His face was pale, unreadable. "Madam Chair," he said, voice steady but low, "in light of the evidence just presented, I am formally withdrawing my statement of support for Helix Biocorp and rescinding my co-sponsorship of House Bill 488. The room reacted not with applause, but awe. Varnell's name had been on biotech fundraising invitations for years, and now, mid-hearing, he had turned his back. For the first time that day, Shkreli looked vulnerable. Not angry, not mocking, but cornered. Everything he had tried to control, through structure, secrecy, manipulation, had unraveled in under 5 minutes. Not because of politics, but because truth, when fully shown, leaves nowhere to hide. Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't gloat. She didn't grandstand. She simply closed her folder, folded her hands, and looked straight ahead. Because in that moment, justice didn't need volume. It needed only the courage to reveal what was hidden and the strength to let it be seen. What began as a hearing had now become something far more powerful, a rupture in the political machinery that could no longer contain the truth. And once that rupture began, it moved like fire. The instant Jasmine Crockett laid out the final piece, the audio, the paper trail, the shell company, the room combusted into motion. What had started as a tightly controlled proceeding turned into a chorus of demands for accountability. Several lawmakers stood at once, voices overlapping with urgency, not chaos. "This needs to go to the DOJ," shouted one. "We need immediate oversight hearings," said another. Others demanded subpoenas, asset freezes, and criminal referrals. Not next week, not after recess, but now. There was no hesitation, no party lines, just an instinctive reaction to the kind of deception too bold to ignore and too systemic to downplay. The committee's legal staff scrambled to document requests as aides rushed from the room, phones pressed to their ears, already coordinating with federal investigators. The entire hearing chamber had shifted from inquiry to action. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat. She didn't even move. She simply watched the storm unfold, the storm she had triggered with nothing more than the truth. But the shock waves didn't stop at the walls of Capitol Hill. Outside, in real time, a different kind of testimony was taking place. Patients who had once been voiceless were now speaking. Thousands of emails poured into the committee's inbox within the hour, from mothers, doctors, nurses, cancer survivors, and hospice workers. A former AIDS patient from Chicago wrote, "For 10 years, I rationed medication so my son could eat. What you did today finally made me feel seen. A rural physician from Alabama posted a video that went viral within minutes. I've lost patients not because I failed them, but because the system was designed to. Representative Crockett, thank you for saying what the rest of us can't afford to. Medical boards, advocacy groups, and even conservative healthcare coalitions began issuing public statements. The sentiment was clear. This wasn't political anymore. It was moral. And Jasmine Crockett had just redrawn the line. And then, amid the momentum, Martin Shkreli broke. His posture, once smug and composed, dissolved into something more volatile. He had been sitting in silence for nearly 15 minutes, watching his defenses collapse piece by piece. The tape, the chart, the withdrawal of support from a key Republican ally, all of it left him with nowhere to hide. His hands tightened, his jaw clenched. Then, he slammed his fist against the table. The sound cracked like a gunshot through the chamber. Microphones shook. Conversation stopped. He leaned forward, face flushed, voice trembling not with fear but with rage. "This is a show trial," he spat. "You're not a leader, Crockett. You're a professional manipulator. A populist with a law degree." The words were meant to wound. They came sharp, fast, desperate. "You don't care about justice. You care about headlines. You're a fraud." For a moment, the room went cold. Not because of what he said, but because of what it revealed. Shkreli wasn't just angry, he was unraveling. This wasn't strategy anymore. It was instinct. The instinct of a man watching power slip through his fingers and realizing too late that he'd finally met someone he couldn't outmaneuver. Jasmine didn't rise to meet him. She didn't dignify the attack with a rebuttal. She simply turned her head, slowly, evenly, and looked him dead in the eye. The silence that followed didn't need punctuation. It was final. And in that moment, the entire chamber understood. This wasn't about left or right, profit or loss. It was about the kind of country we choose to be when someone finally dares to expose what we've allowed behind closed doors. After the venom of Shkreli's outburst dissipated, the chamber sat in weighted silence. Not from fear, but from the understanding that something irreversible had just occurred. And Jasmine Crockett rose, not to retaliate, but to deliver the truth with the clarity of someone who'd carried it far too long. She stood with the gravity of someone who understood what this moment truly meant, not just for the people in the room, but for every American watching from hospital beds, kitchen tables, and crowded pharmacies. Her gaze locked on Shkreli, not with hatred, but with the steady precision of justice sharpening its edge. There was no need for theatrics. The silence was her stage, and every word she was about to say had been forged from the years of stories she'd heard. Families ruined, lives lost, dignity stolen in the name of economic theory. She took a breath, not to collect herself, but to control the fire that had burned behind her restraint all morning. And then she said it, not as a soundbite, not as a performance, but as a sentence meant to last long after headlines faded. "Getting rich off other people's desperation isn't innovation," she said, her voice calm and deliberate. "It's a licensed form of crime." The weight of the words hung there, real, plain, and undeniable. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to explain, because everyone in that room knew exactly what she meant. Shkreli had wrapped himself in contracts, shell corporations, and clever excuses. But at its core, his business model depended on people being too poor, too sick, or too desperate to fight back. "You didn't invent anything," she continued, her voice steady but deeper now, heavy with truth. "You didn't cure a disease. You just figured out how to trap people inside one and charge them rent." Even the stenographer paused for a split second, the tension so thick it felt physical. "You used paperwork as armor, law firms as cover, and every time someone died waiting for a price to drop, you told yourself it was just the market working." She looked around the room, not at Shkreli now, but at the faces of the lawmakers, the aides, the press. "But there is a difference between what's legal and what's moral," she said, the steel returning to her tone. "And today you've made it clear to the entire country which side of that line you chose." Her hands remained still at her sides. Her eyes never dropped. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. Because this wasn't a moment for triumph. It was a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett had just delivered it. Not in anger, but with the quiet, devastating force of a truth that could no longer be ignored. Jasmine Crockett's final words didn't echo. They detonated. And in the stunned quiet that followed, the wheels of power, long dormant in the face of corporate deceit, finally began to turn. This time they turned fast. Before the hearing had even adjourned, the ripple had become a wave. Reporters were already confirming through unnamed sources that the Department of Justice had reopened its file on Martin Shkreli. Not just on his past convictions, but on Helix Biocorp, its ownership structure, its offshore capital flows, its encrypted servers. By noon, DOJ agents had requested formal transcripts of the hearing. By 2, the House Oversight Committee had received an emergency coordination memo from the Office of White-Collar Crime. The signal was unmistakable. This wasn't political anymore. It was prosecutorial. Jasmine had done more than humiliate a man. She had handed the government a map to the rot he thought he'd buried. And then, as if timed to match the shift in the air, Helix Biocorp's stock froze. Trading halted. Charts flatlined. In less than 7 minutes, billions in projected valuation were reduced to digital stillness. Shareholders stared at frozen tickers, unable to buy, sell, or flee. Investment firms began calling crisis meetings. Quiet warnings turned to public panic. This wasn't just a reputational crisis. It was a systemic freeze, triggered by truth. Behind the scenes, financial regulators combed through filings, cross-checking addresses, nominee directors, and internal memos. At the Securities and Exchange Commission, an emergency task force convened by 3:40 p.m. Eastern. Helix's legal team issued a statement calling the freeze procedural, but the markets weren't buying it, because this time, the lies had faces, audio, and a congressional record. Back in Washington, Jasmine Crockett walked out of room 2141 to a corridor crowded with reporters. Flashes erupted, questions flew, but she didn't speak, not yet. She paused, looked down the hallway lined with cameras and cords, then nodded once to her chief of staff before stepping into a private elevator. This wasn't her victory lap. It was the beginning of something bigger. Across the country, the story was no longer just about Martin Shkreli. It was about a system unmasked, a reckoning decades overdue, and a woman who had dragged corruption into the daylight, armed with facts and a voice that refused to flinch. In New York, the DOJ task force filed a preliminary motion to unseal financial records linked to Helix and its shell subsidiaries. Prosecutors described the evidence presented in Congress as material and compelling. Meanwhile, FBI agents quietly requested federal warrants to access cloud servers and private correspondence. Every firewall Shkreli had built, legal, digital, political, was beginning to collapse. By 6 p.m., news tickers across the country ran a synchronized headline. DOJ reopens case against Shkreli. Helix stock frozen. Investigation expands. Wall Street analysts who had once defended Helix as disruptive biotech were now purging their coverage. And ordinary Americans, the ones who'd watched this entire saga unfold, weren't just commenting, they were remembering. Remembering the pills they couldn't afford, the hospital visits denied, the funerals funded by GoFundMe, and in that memory, anger turned into momentum. Helix's phone lines were jammed. Protesters began gathering outside its Manhattan office before sunset. By the time the CEO, one of the Ivy League names Shkreli had bragged about, stepped outside, he was met with chants, signs, and questions he could no longer avoid. Who really owns you? Where's the research you promised? Did he plan this from prison? Cameras caught the moment he turned back and shut the door behind him. Inside the Capitol, Jasmine returned to her office as dozens of emails flooded in. Messages from doctors, former Helix employees, legal experts offering assistance. One note stood out. It was short. It read, "You didn't just expose a company, you exposed an era. We see you. We're ready." And in that quiet moment, before the storm widened, before the indictments came, Jasmine Crockett sat down, opened her notebook, and began outlining the next bill. Because truth alone wasn't enough. The system that allowed this to happen had to be dismantled piece by piece, and she knew exactly where to start. As the Justice Department dismantled the machinery Shkreli had built, The nation turned its eyes back to Capitol Hill, where Jasmine Crockett was already preparing her next move. Because punishment alone wasn't enough. There had to be prevention. There had to be law. It came less than 4 weeks after the hearing that changed everything. The corridors of Congress, once gridlocked by partisanship and pharmaceutical lobbying, now pulsed with urgency. A single-page draft, bold, unflinching, circulated through committees with speed rarely seen in Washington. At its center was a name that had, in the weeks since the scandal, become synonymous with accountability: the Crockett Bill. The text was clear. It capped pharmaceutical price increases at no more than 100% within any 12-month period. No exceptions, no loopholes. Violators would face federal fines, licensing suspensions, and mandatory restitution to patients. Lobbyists scrambled. Industry insiders warned of economic disruption. But the public wasn't listening to them anymore. They were listening to the woman who refused to let business as usual be the language of suffering. On the morning of the vote, the Capitol was packed. Protesters and supporters lined the steps, many holding up empty pill bottles, some holding photos of those they'd lost: parents, siblings, children, faces that had never made it to the hearing, but whose stories lived inside every clause of that bill. Inside, the chamber was electric. Jasmine sat quietly in the front row, the sponsor of a bill written in ink but driven by lived experience. She had been told it would take years. She had been warned it was too ambitious. And yet, here it was, on the floor, in front of the nation, facing a moment no lobby could bury. One by one, members of Congress stood to cast their votes. A few gave short speeches, but most simply nodded, because this wasn't about debate anymore. It was about decency. When the final vote was called, the chamber held still. The clerk read the tally. The Crockett bill had passed, with a bipartisan majority. The room erupted, not with applause, but with something quieter, heavier, a collective exhale. Years of outrage, of helplessness, of empty prescriptions and silent grief had finally pushed through the floor of Congress. Reporters scrambled. Phones lit up across the country. And Jasmine Crockett? She stood slowly, nodded once, and quietly left the chamber. Not in triumph, but in fulfillment. The headlines followed within minutes. Congress passes Crockett Bill, historic clampdown on drug price gouging. Jasmine Crockett's legacy begins, with legislation that changes everything. But the real response wasn't in the headlines. It was in the letters pouring into her office. A single mother from Detroit wrote, "For the first time in years, I filled a prescription and didn't cry in the parking lot." A Vietnam veteran from Texas wrote, "I buried my wife because we couldn't afford another round of chemo. Thank you for making sure no one else has to make that decision." Doctors sent messages of relief. Pharmacies prepared for change. And Wall Street, it adjusted. Because no market, no matter how large, was bigger than a government finally remembering who it serves. And through it all, Jasmine remained steady. She didn't revel in victory. She returned to her desk, her notes, her next challenge. Because this bill, powerful as it was only the first line in a much longer fight. One law couldn't undo decades of quiet exploitation, but it could end the lie that nothing could be done. It could prove that one hearing, one voice, one act of courage was enough to break the silence. And as the sun set over the Capitol dome that evening, the nation didn't just celebrate a vote. It remembered who justice looks like when it stands tall, tells the truth, and writes the law. The Crockett Bill had become law, but its impact was rippling far beyond American borders. And soon, the woman who had stood alone in a storm of corporate power would take the world stage. This time not to fight, but to lead. Geneva, Switzerland. The iconic marble hall of the World Health Organization was filled wall to wall. Health ministers, global CEOs, activists, journalists, and public servants from over 90 countries. But on this day, every seat faced one podium, and every conversation circled one name: Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Invited as the keynote speaker at the WHO Global Ethics Summit, she wasn't there as a politician. She was there as a symbol of accountability, of defiance, of moral clarity in a system that had long confused profit with progress. Her face had appeared on magazine covers, but she wore no designer suit, no practiced smile. She stepped to the lectern in the same calm, grounded presence she had carried through every hearing, every attack, every silence that begged to be broken. The room quieted, not out of protocol, but anticipation. Cameras flickered. Jasmine looked out, not at celebrities or CEOs, but at people who had spent years fighting the same battles she had fought in Washington. The war between access and exploitation, between need and greed. She opened her remarks not with data, not with titles, but with a name. Elijah, the 13-year-old boy from the video shown in Congress, the child who had become a face of what unchecked markets could do to vulnerable lives. In the world's most powerful economy, she said, voice low but unwavering, a child was priced out of survival, and we called that legal. A murmur passed through the crowd, not disagreement, but recognition, because her story wasn't just America's, it was everyone's. She didn't speak in abstractions. She told of mothers skipping meals to buy antibiotics, of clinics in Mississippi closing their doors while biotech CEOs bought third yachts, of patents traded like poker chips across borders while patients begged for expired pills. But what made her words cut deeper than policy papers was their origin, not from theory, but from proximity. She had sat in those courtrooms. She had stared down the men who turned disease into dividends. Innovation means nothing, she said, if it only travels the roads wealth has paved. Medicine is not medicine if it isn't reachable. Her speech wasn't fiery, it was surgical. And in the tension between every word, she held the room in stillness, not by commanding it, but by telling the truth no one else had dared to center in that building before. Health is not a privilege to be sold. It is a right long overdue to be defended. As she finished, she didn't ask for applause, she asked for commitment. This is not about one country, she said. This is about a species deciding what kind of future it's willing to fund. Because if we allow suffering to remain profitable, we are not curing disease. We are institutionalizing it. For a long second after she stepped away, no one moved. The pause wasn't confusion. It was reverence. Then the room stood, not out of tradition, but because they knew they had just witnessed a moment that would outlive the microphones and the cameras. Outside, press from 6 continents reported it the same way. A quiet revolution had just walked across the WHO stage and left every government in the world with one less excuse. While the world stood to applaud Jasmine Crockett at the World Health Organization in a far quieter corner of the justice system, another verdict was signed, one that didn't need cheers to declare its finality. It came in ink, not thunder, but it stripped away everything Shkreli had ever built his power upon. The ruling was historic. For the first time in modern U.S. legal history, a private citizen was not only prosecuted and punished for corporate fraud, but was permanently banned from holding any intellectual property rights in medicine, biotech, or pharmaceuticals. Not just in name, not just within a company. The ban was comprehensive. Any trademark, formula, patent, or proprietary technology within the health sector, even if developed by someone else, could not bear his signature, ownership, or financial link. The ruling cited willful, repeated exploitation of life-saving therapies for private gain, and a proven pattern of evading regulatory structures through deceit. It was more than a legal sentence. It was a statement to the world that the machinery of exploitation could no longer hide behind innovation. Martin Shkreli, once a rising star of Wall Street biotech, was no longer a tycoon. He was now a cautionary tale codified into law. The enforcement was swift. Within 72 hours, federal agents served writs to dissolve his stake in dormant shell corporations. International patent offices were notified by U.S. trade officials, and on the SEC's public blacklist, his name appeared in bold, barred from future filings. Helix Biocorp's assets were frozen indefinitely. Investigators seized every electronic device linked to his former firms. Consultants and lawyers scrambled to distance themselves. But there was no legal maneuver left. His power, once hidden in layered ownership structures and offshore filings, had been surgically dismantled. And what remained was a name that now opened no doors, inspired no fear, and unlocked no accounts. His new cell was quieter than the last. Smaller. A single window faced a high brick wall. No natural light reached the concrete floor. His access to digital media was limited to a state-curated tablet, No apps, no browsing, only approved video archives and select news bulletins. But it was on that screen, loaded under the Congressional Proceedings category, that the moment of reckoning waited for him. The same clip that had reshaped global healthcare policy, that had gone viral in 26 countries, that had inspired a generation of whistleblowers and physicians to speak, now played on repeat in a silent prison block with no escape. He tapped play. The screen lit up with the image of Jasmine Crockett standing tall behind the microphone in room 2141. Her eyes locked forward, not just at him, but through him. There was no grandstanding, no raised voice, just the sound of something heavier than law, truth stripped of compromise. Getting rich off other people's desperation isn't innovation. It's a licensed form of crime. You didn't build a cure, you built a cage, and you sold the key to the highest bidder. This isn't capitalism. This is cruelty wearing a lab coat. And then the sound he could never forget. Applause. Prolonged, unstoppable, standing ovation. It hadn't come from political allies or partisan crowds. It had come from survivors, mothers, frontline doctors, lifelong skeptics, people who, for the first time, had seen the system speak with a human voice. And it wasn't his. Shkreli sat motionless. The smugness was gone. So was the confidence, the ego, the certainty that loopholes could always be found, that wealth could always outrun justice. In its place was silence, a silence so absolute it seemed to press in from the walls. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of understanding, the kind that sinks in only when there is no more spin, no more audience, no more distance from consequence. He played the clip again and again. Each time, he watched Jasmine deliver the same line with the same unshakable clarity. Each time the applause rose at the end. Each time he had to sit with the knowledge that the world didn't just reject him, it had recalibrated around what he had revealed. He wasn't the innovator. He was the infection. And she had been the diagnosis the system refused to delay any longer. Elsewhere, the Crockett bill had already begun saving lives. Drug manufacturers rewrote pricing models. Insurance companies adjusted coverage rates. A global summit was planned to create international standards using the language she had forged in that hearing room. And for the first time, nations from every region were citing a single American voice, not as an academic, not as a diplomat, but as the woman who called cruelty what it was and gave the world permission to do the same. Back in the cell, Shkreli stared at the tablet as the clip played for the fifth time. But this time, he didn't look angry. He didn't even blink. His hands sat in his lap, palms open, because he knew. The business empire, the clever games, the illusion of invincibility, they were gone. What remained was a permanent stain on the system's memory, and a single voice that would forever stand as the one he couldn't outtalk, outrun, or outlast. Jasmine Crockett had stripped away the mask, and justice at last had a face. The screen dimmed, the clip stopped, and in the sterile stillness of a federal cell in Virginia, Martin Shkreli sat frozen, not in fear, but in recognition. Recognition that the world outside had moved on, that everything he once built on arrogance and loopholes had collapsed not with a gunshot or a raid, but with a voice, Jasmine Crockett's voice. And now that voice no longer echoed in a courtroom, it resonated in global policy. Outside the prison walls, a movement was unfolding, quietly, steadily, unstoppably. The Crockett bill, once doubted, debated, and resisted, had taken root not only in American law, but in the very language of international health reform. Less than a year after its passage, parliaments in over a dozen countries were reviewing sister legislation, some word for word. The European Parliament introduced Crockett clauses into its Drug Price Equity Act. The Canadian Ministry of Health, long mired in negotiations with private distributors, pointed to the U.S. framework as proof that bold policy was not only possible, but necessary. In São Paulo, protesters outside a hospital held signs in Portuguese that translated simply to, "Don't price us out." Crockett showed the way. But while others celebrated, Jasmine did not. She refused interviews on primetime shows, declined invitations to ribbon cuttings, keynote dinners, and Sunday morning panels. When a prestigious media outlet named her the conscience of Capitol Hill, she sent back a handwritten reply that read only, "Justice isn't a headline." While the world built monuments, she went home. To Dallas, then Detroit, then Jackson. Not to pose for photos, but to listen. To return to the rooms where suffering had once spoken in whispers. In Detroit, she sat with pharmacists in a break room behind a store where, not long ago, they'd had to choose between stocking EpiPens or keeping the lights on. They didn't ask for policy updates. They just said thank you and offered her a folding chair. In Mississippi, she visited a single mother whose teenage son now had daily access to a rare immune-boosting drug that had once cost $400 a vial. There was no press, no statement, just Jasmine sitting quietly on a worn couch, listening as a woman cried not out of pain, but relief. These weren't campaign stops. These were repairs. Quiet acts of restoration in the places policy had ignored for decades. Jasmine didn't treat them like victories. She treated them like obligations. Change that's real doesn't end with applause, she told her staff. It ends when people don't have to beg for what should have always been theirs. Still, the world refused to forget her. Her speech at the WHO was transcribed in 24 languages. Schools across Europe added her name to global ethics curricula. Medical students in Nairobi recited her quote during a demonstration. Health isn't innovation until it's accessible. In London, her testimony was used in the drafting of new public health procurement contracts. And back in the US, a growing number of law schools added the Crockett Bill to their coursework, not as a case study, but as a precedent, under a new section titled Functional Ethics in Crisis Governance. But Jasmine resisted canonization. When a bipartisan congressional delegation proposed naming a new federal pharmaceutical oversight body in her honor, she hesitated. The vote passed. The Jasmine Crockett Center for Pharmaceutical Equity. She skipped the ribbon cutting. Instead, she sent a recorded message. It lasted just 17 seconds. Justice, she said, isn't something you hold. It's something you hand forward. And it was being handed forward. In Rwanda, a hospital director wrote to say a rural clinic used her hearing footage to pressure distributors into cutting prices. In Manila, a nurses' union held a vigil for patients lost to pricing hikes and ended it by declaring Jasmine an honorary member. In rural Alabama, a health administrator started a scholarship in her name for students studying health law. Back in Washington, something quieter was happening. The stories had changed. For years, congressional staffers had gotten letters filled with desperation, pleas from patients who couldn't afford insulin, seizure medication, chemotherapy. Now they were getting new letters from patients who could, from parents who had found a full month of refills on the shelf for the first time in years, from elderly couples who could finally afford both groceries and medicine in the same week. Advocacy groups began to track the results, a 43% drop in catastrophic pricing incidents across the country. Dozens of rural hospitals, once weeks away from closure, began reporting financial stabilization. Pharmacies in low-income ZIP codes stopped rationing basic supplies. On the one-year anniversary of the hearing, there were no parades, no interviews, no commemorative pins. But in Brooklyn, a mural appeared overnight on the side of an abandoned urgent care clinic. It showed Jasmine, her face half-shadowed, standing tall, not triumphant, resolute. Around her were not politicians, not celebrities, but names. Names of real people, cancer survivors, diabetic patients, sickle cell warriors. Names of those who had written her, fought beside her, lived because of her. Across the top were 5 words, spray-painted in stark white. She listened. Then she changed everything. Back in her office, Jasmine stared at a copy of that mural taped to the inside of her drawer. No fanfare, no caption, just the image and the memory of how it all began. Not with a viral moment, not even with a bill, but with a chair in a courtroom, a child on a screen, and the decision to speak a sentence no one had dared to say aloud. And in that silence, the one that came after the applause, after the hearings, after the headlines, the real legacy began, not carved in stone, but in prescription labels. Clinic doors reopened, and the breath of a 13-year-old boy who no longer had to wait. Time passed. The headlines faded. The hearings gave way to new legislative cycles. But some names lingered longer than others, etched into memory not by fame, but by consequence. Martin Shkreli's name was not one of them. What once had been a symbol of bold arrogance, quoted in finance podcasts, idolized in certain corners of Silicon Valley as brilliant disruption, was now disappearing from public life. One server, one archive, one syllabus at a time. He was not martyred. He was not mythologized. He was deleted. It started quietly. Universities removed his case from strategy modules and reclassified it under predatory conduct. Business schools that had once taught his pricing model as a case study in market leverage now issued formal apologies to patient advocacy groups. At one institution, a professor who once called him cold but correct was forced to step down after student protest. Textbooks changed. Footnotes were rewritten. Entire chapters collapsed into a single line. This practice was outlawed under the Crockett Act of 2026. Then came the legal removals. Government procurement blacklists, civil forfeitures. Every LLC, trust, and silent partner agreement linked to Shkreli was scrubbed from active pharmaceutical records. International trade regulators placed lifetime bans on his participation in drug licensing. And in the ultimate irony, the patents he once hoarded like trophies, patents that gave him the power to raise prices by 5,000% overnight, were redistributed under public access clauses. Hospitals now used his former assets not to profit, but to heal. In the prison system, Shkreli faded into routine. Inmates called him the medicine guy with no trace of awe. He was denied access to private visitors. His attempts to publish commentary were intercepted and blocked. The last blog post he'd ever written was flagged for misinformation. Even his old Twitter accounts, once buzzing with sarcastic jabs, were permanently suspended. The final image most people remembered was a still frame from the congressional hearing. Jasmine Crockett staring him down, the words licensed crime frozen in subtitles beneath her. And while his name was being erased, hers was being carved, quietly, deliberately, into stone. Washington, D.C., late autumn. The morning was overcast when the crowd gathered just beyond the Capitol reflecting pool. No pomp, no security lines. Just folding chairs, a modest podium, and a tarp-covered statue. The attendees weren't dignitaries. They were nurses, pharmacists, teachers, former patients, parents who had once been told that survival came second to cost. They didn't bring press kits. They brought prescription bottles with labels that no longer bankrupted them. When the tarp was pulled back, the figure beneath wasn't grandiose. It wasn't marble or gold. It was cast in weathered bronze. Jasmine Crockett standing at a lectern, left hand holding a slim binder, right hand extended, not as a gesture of power, but of insistence. Her eyes weren't cast downward in humility or upward in hope. They were level, staring straight ahead. Beneath the statue, the inscription read, Jasmine Crockett, truth is the law that fear cannot silence. In memory of every voice raised too late, in honor of the ones who raised it in time. Jasmine didn't attend the ceremony. She watched it from a small office in Houston, where she was consulting on a new bill targeting medical debt collection. Her team offered to host a live-stream Q&A. She declined. Instead, she sent a single message to be read aloud at the unveiling. If a name is worth remembering, let it be because it made someone else's life less impossible. The crowd stood in silence after the message was read. Some cried, not out of grief, but out of the strange, unfamiliar feeling that the system had, for once, chosen someone who actually deserved the pedestal. And yet Jasmine never stopped. A week later, she appeared unannounced at a rural clinic in West Virginia that had just reopened after years of closure. No press followed her. No mayor met her. She simply walked in, asked how they were managing under the new pricing reforms, and took notes. She returned to her hotel alone, typed up a report for a Senate subcommittee, and declined an interview with a major network. Policy, she once said, should never have a publicist. Meanwhile, in a small federal correctional facility, Martin Shkreli received the monthly news bulletin provided to inmates. On page 3, under public policy highlights, was a photo of the statue. The image was cropped, the resolution low, but the posture was unmistakable. He stared at it for several minutes, then turned the page, then stared again. The caption under the photo read, "Capitol Honors Representative, Jasmine Crockett for legislative courage and medical ethics reform." He didn't speak. He didn't curse. He didn't throw the bulletin across the room. He folded it, carefully, neatly, placed it back on the metal desk. Because even he knew this was permanent. No media outlet would quote him again. No investor would return his calls. His name would never be attached to a cure, a discovery, or a company ticker. The only name that would survive the moment, the only one etched into court records, legislative history, and the skin of a bronze statue, was hers. And in a world finally learning the difference between genius and harm, that was enough. Long after the hearings ended, after the courtroom lights dimmed and the headlines moved on, one truth remained, etched deeper than any law or statute. This wasn't just a political reckoning. It was a human one. And with it came a lesson the world could no longer afford to ignore. The real battle wasn't fought in marble buildings or under the glow of TV cameras. It was fought in doctors' offices where mothers clutched expired prescriptions. In back rooms of pharmacies where staff debated which patients could get their meds and which would walk away empty-handed. In hospital corridors where men in suits justified suffering as economic consequence. That was the battlefield Jasmine Crockett stepped into. Not with fury, but with clarity. Not because she wanted to become a symbol, but because someone had to say what the system refused to admit, that we had built an empire on pain and called it progress. What she faced wasn't just Shkreli's smirk or corporate greed. It was a structure designed to strip humanity from numbers until no one remembered what those numbers stood for. And she stood again and again against the tide of that machine, not to be righteous, but to remind us all that dignity should never be sold in monthly installments. The human lesson buried in the courtroom transcript is this: we normalized cruelty. We let price tags determine who lived and who didn't. We let innovation mean exclusive, let access mean optional. In the name of profit, we turned survival into a transaction and convinced ourselves that competition made the system stronger, even if it left our neighbors weaker. Shkreli wasn't an anomaly. He was a mirror, and Jasmine forced the country to look into it. She showed us that we had mistaken loopholes for intelligence, extraction for excellence. Her confrontation wasn't just against a man, it was against the story we kept telling ourselves to avoid responsibility. And when she broke it open, piece by piece, what spilled out wasn't just corruption, it was complicity. Ours. But there was another truth. One harder to accept, but more powerful. It didn't have to stay that way. One voice sharpened by principle, backed by evidence, and driven by the quiet fury of lived reality, can start an avalanche. Jasmine proved that policy doesn't have to be numb, that courage doesn't have to scream to be seismic. Her strength wasn't just in how she dismantled lies. It was in how she made space for truths that had been whispered, dismissed, and buried. In a world obsessed with noise, she made silence meaningful. She showed that justice isn't always a hammer. Sometimes it's a mirror held steady long enough for the world to see itself and choose something better. And what the world saw, when it finally looked, was a system built upside down, where pharmaceutical empires could rise while children died waiting, where lobbyists could craft exceptions while nurses worked double shifts, where the word ethics was stamped on strategy decks but never on supply chains. Jasmine forced that system to answer to the one thing it was never prepared to face: accountability measured in human cost. And when she spoke, when she called exploitation a licensed form of crime, it wasn't just a line. It was a line drawn in the sand, a moral boundary that said, from this point on, we name the harm, we trace its architect, and we fight for those who never had the podium to begin with. If there is a lesson to be remembered, it is this: change doesn't come when it's convenient. It comes when someone decides that comfort can no longer be prioritized over conscience. Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for consensus. She created it. She didn't wait for permission. She spoke until silence had nowhere left to hide. Her story isn't one of perfection. It's one of precision, of showing up, of staying when the cameras left, of fighting when the system tried to shame her into silence. And that's the most human lesson of all, that every injustice persists until someone chooses not to look away. So remember this. The next time a system says, it's just business, ask, at whose expense? The next time a voice like Jasmine's speaks into the storm, don't wait for the wind to stop. Listen, because the stories we tell about justice are only as strong as the people willing to live them out when it costs everything to do so. And if one voice can break a silence this loud, then what excuse do the rest of us have? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a packed congressional hearing watched by over 14 million Americans, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett goes head-to-head with billionaire Charles Koch over his secret political network used to quietly reshape U.S. law. But when Jasmine reveals irrefutable evidence, the room erupts. Koch is left speechless, and within hours, federal prosecutors close in. What happens when power finally shatters, and the man who thought he owned Congress becomes the one under investigation? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The doors opened with a quiet force, like a trigger being pulled. Jasmine Crockett entered the chamber not with fanfare, but with fire behind her eyes. Her steps were sharp, deliberate, heels clicking on marble as if marking the countdown to something unstoppable. The room was packed, cameras fixed, aides frozen, and political operatives eyeing her like a threat wrapped in a suit. She didn't smile, didn't nod. She sat at the table like a woman who knew the system wasn't made for her and came to break it anyway. The chairman struck his gavel. This hearing is now in session. We are here to examine allegations of unlawful political influence and dark money tied to Koch Industries. Jasmine opened her folder without looking up. Her silence was louder than any statement. Behind her, tension crackled. Across from her, a wall of suits whispered to each other with forced calm. This wasn't oversight, it was confrontation. Then came him. The doors opened again, and Charles Koch entered like a storm in a tailored coat. Flanked by attorneys and shadowed by silence, he didn't glance at Jasmine. His cane tapped the floor like punctuation on a threat. He sat slowly, as if the room already belonged to him. A clerk approached with the oath card. "Sir, please raise your right hand." He stared at her like she was interrupting a board meeting. Then, with a half smile and voice like silk wrapped around contempt, he replied, "I answer to the Constitution, not to a political theater." Gasps rippled through the room. Cameras zoomed. Someone from the back muttered, "Did he just—" But Jasmine didn't move. She sat, straight-backed, watching him. And in that silence, the war began. The room had frozen after Koch's defiant oath. But Jasmine didn't rise to meet the insult. She didn't need to. Her reply wouldn't come from her mouth. It would come from the screen behind her. She raised the remote control with the kind of calm that made people nervous. No grand gestures, no showmanship, just precision. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the chamber in pale white light. Then it bled into complexity. Lines, loops, and clusters spreading outward like a virus under glass. No one spoke. The image was stark, mathematical, undeniable. A network so vast it looked more like a global intelligence operation than a domestic political structure. "This," Jasmine began, standing now, voice steady and clear, "is not a conspiracy, it's a structure." A series of circles lit up on the screen, each tagged with the name of a nonprofit, a think tank, a legal fund, or a voter outreach group. They didn't share logos. They didn't share staff, but they all shared one thing: a financial lifeline that traced back to Koch Industries, a silent hand moving pieces on a national chessboard. The chamber leaned in. "A web of 72 interconnected organizations," she continued, pointing with a laser at the tangled cluster in the center, each with a distinct mission: climate denial, tax suppression, anti-reform propaganda. but all fed by a common source. Lines connected circles like a criminal syndicate map. Some curved toward election super PACs. Others vanished into shell corporations registered in Delaware or Nevada, states notorious for corporate secrecy. Jasmine zoomed in on one node. This one funneled $18 million into state campaigns to block climate regulation, using funds routed through a nonprofit registered to a P.O. box in Delaware. She turned to the panel. A P.O. box, not a boardroom, not an office, not a single named employee, just a mailbox. And from that mailbox came the power to rewrite state law. Gas whispered through the gallery. Journalists scribbled. A young intern from the back leaned forward in disbelief. Jasmine didn't stop. "We are not looking at policy influence," she said, letting the pointer drop to her side. "We are looking at policy laundering, a system designed not to persuade voters, but to bypass them entirely." The screen changed. New figures appeared. $14 million to kill progressive tax reforms in the Midwest. $22 million to crush prison reform in 4 states. A PAC in Georgia received $9 million in under 6 months, filed no public spending disclosures, then dissolved quietly just before midterms. "These aren't coincidences," Jasmine said, her tone tightening. "They are engineered obstructions, legal ghosts wearing the masks of public will." A silence fell over the chamber. Not awkward, but heavy, like gravity had shifted. She turned slowly, deliberately, to face the committee, and then to face Charles Koch. "And who built this machine? Who operates the levers, writes the checks, erases the trail?" She raised a hand and pointed, not for theatrics, but for truth. "The man sitting right there." All heads turned. Koch didn't blink. He remained still, chin slightly lifted, but his knuckles had tightened just enough around the handle of his cane for Jasmine to see it, and that was enough. The numbers on the screen had settled, but the silence they left behind hadn't. It wasn't just quiet, it was held breath. Jasmine had laid out the network like a surgeon exposing a tumor, precise, irrefutable, and bleeding at the root. People weren't just listening, they were absorbing, reeling. For a few long seconds, even Charles Koch sat still, as if calculating the room's reaction. But men like him don't sit in silence for long. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. He simply lifted his hand and began to tap 2 fingers, index and middle, against the polished mahogany desk in front of him. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythm designed not to draw attention, but to command it. He leaned forward, elbows resting lightly, as though this were just another quarterly earnings meeting. The smirk came next, subtle, practiced. The kind of smile built over decades of getting what you want without ever having to raise your voice. When he finally spoke, his tone was low but steady, sharp enough to cut without sounding like a threat. "That's called participation in democracy," he said, letting the word democracy linger just long enough to sound hollow. "You should try it sometime, with your own money." There it was, not just a deflection, but a dagger, delivered with the grace of a man who had long learned to insult without raising suspicion. The statement wasn't meant to debate policy. It was meant to diminish her, to remind everyone in the room, and perhaps Jasmine most of all, that he wasn't just wealthy, he was untouchable. That in his version of democracy, access was earned not by merit or truth, but by the weight of your wallet. Several heads turned. One senator coughed to mask discomfort. A reporter's pen froze mid-sentence. But Jasmine didn't flinch, not even a breath. Because the moment wasn't about responding to his tone. It was about exposing his premise. And as the tap of his fingers faded, her silence said what no soundbite ever could. She wasn't playing defense. She was loading the next round. Koch's words still hung in the air, smug and polished, like a gavel made of gold. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't argue. She clicked to the next slide, and this time the screen didn't show charts. It showed names. 3 email threads appeared on the screen behind Jasmine. Clean, corporate, clinical. Each bearing the weight of implication in font size 12. She took a breath, then stepped to the side, allowing the room to take them in. No voiceover, no flourish, just silence and sentences. Time-stamped proof of proximity between money and legislation. The names were not anonymous staffers or distant aides. They were sitting U.S. senators, powerful, visible, and until this moment, unexposed. Jasmine spoke with the slow clarity of someone who didn't need to dramatize the truth because the truth had done that work already. "Let the record reflect," she said, her voice steady. "These aren't editorials. They're instructions." She moved her laser pointer to the first email, dated 3 weeks before a key emissions bill was introduced. Koch's senior legal counsel had since suggested edits directly to a senator's personal legislative aid. Not suggestions, rewrites. Replace mandatory carbon compliance with voluntary reduction incentives, the email read. In another, the subject line was blunt. Proposed language, energy relief clause. Below it, a fully drafted paragraph, pre-formatted and ready for insertion into federal statute. Jasmine paused before she read the closing line aloud. Replace enforcement clause with a voluntary compliance incentive. Language drafted below. No one in the room moved. She turned to the committee now, eyes locked on each face in turn. "When a private citizen writes the law," she said, "and elected officials merely upload it, is that democracy or something else?" The weight of her words didn't drop. They settled like ash after fire. For a moment, no one breathed. Then slowly, Charles Koch shifted in his chair. He wasn't flustered, but he wasn't still either. He adjusted his cufflinks, not out of habit, but with purpose, and leaned into the microphone with a voice so polished it felt pre-recorded. "Senator Crockett," he said, his tone half amused, half dismissive, "if political conversation is now considered a crime, you'd better indict every lobbyist in Washington." The words were calculated, designed to draw a laugh, and they did. A soft ripple from a few conservative seats. A signal. But Jasmine stood unmoved. She didn't blink, didn't smirk. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the gap between herself and the table. Not with confrontation, but with calm authority. Her voice came quiet, yet carved with precision. "Not every lobbyist funds the pen and decides the ink." No one dared to laugh after that, because in one sentence, Jasmine had named what the system refused to see: the difference between influence and control. And the man in front of her had made a career out of pretending there wasn't one. The echo of Jasmine's words had barely faded before another binder slid across the table. Its weight not in pages, but in consequences. What came next wasn't speculation, it was contract. The document appeared not with drama, but with gravity. A leather-bound folder was handed to the clerk, who placed it gently before the chairman like evidence in a trial. Because that's what it was. Jasmine remained standing, but her posture shifted. Shoulders locked, voice measured, presence controlled like a prosecutor walking into closing arguments. On the screen behind her, the heading projected in bold serif font: "The Liberty Initiative, Communication Strategy, Confidential." No conjecture, no interpretation. Just black ink, white paper, and intent made plain. She stepped toward the center of the room, slow but firm, and read aloud. "Use media to plant doubt. Confusion is the goal." The words didn't explode. They settled. Heavy, poisonous, undeniable. The gallery behind her grew still. Staffers froze mid-typing. A reporter's pen slid off the page. The room wasn't processing a revelation. It was processing confirmation. For years, public trust had eroded like shoreline in a storm. Now they knew who had paid for the waves. Jasmine paused just long enough to let the ugliness breathe, then turned back to the committee. "This wasn't outreach," she said. "This wasn't persuasion. This was sabotage by design." Her voice never rose, because it didn't have to. The contract had done the shouting. When truth becomes optional, control becomes inevitable. That was the plan. Not to win hearts, not even to win votes, but to make people stop believing anything is real. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't stunned. It was cornered. You could see it in the shift of suits, in the way some senators looked down not at shame, but at recognition. Because they'd seen this playbook before, in op-eds that asked the wrong questions, in headlines that blurred facts just enough to stall reform. But Charles Koch didn't stall. He didn't stutter. He didn't blink. Leaning back in his chair with the detachment of a man who'd written 1,000 such contracts and watched them all deliver, he adjusted his sleeve with care, then offered a smile, slight, deliberate, surgical. And then in a voice that dripped with calm disdain, he said, "Planting questions isn't manipulation. It's education for those who think too slowly." There it was. Not denial, not regret, just ownership, not of the words, but of the power to say them without consequence. And that was the clearest message he had given all day. Coke's words were still hanging in the air, calculated, arrogant, unrepentant, when something unexpected cracked the rhythm of the room. Not Jasmine, not Coke. Someone from his own side. It began with the soft scrape of a chair leg against the floor, a sound too ordinary to matter until it broke the wall of silence. One of the Republican members of the committee stood slowly, hands trembling just enough to betray what his mouth hadn't said yet. All eyes turned. He wasn't a junior lawmaker. He was seasoned, respected, safe, or so they thought. His voice shook slightly at first, but each word gained weight like a dam giving way. "I have to say something," he began, scanning the room like a man searching for air. "I accepted campaign support from Mr. Koch's networks in 2020, and in exchange I was asked, explicitly, to stall this investigation, to make it go away before it reached this table." Gasps followed, but not the performative kind. These were real, from staffers, from journalists, even from the aides behind Jasmine, who suddenly looked at each other like they'd been handed a live wire. The congressman didn't sit back down. He kept talking. "I told myself it was just politics, that it was harmless." His eyes flicked to Jasmine. "But watching this now, I know it was silence for sale." The confession had shifted something. Not just the mood, but the balance of the entire room. For hours, Charles Koch had controlled the atmosphere without speaking much. His presence alone enough to keep the tension taut, the power dynamic tilted. But the moment a loyalist broke ranks, the illusion cracked, and Koch felt it. It started in his hands, subtle at first, then deliberate. His fingers curled into his palm with slow, mechanical intent, like a man crushing something invisible in his grip. The silence around him wasn't comforting anymore. It was threatening. The kind of silence that doesn't signal respect, but danger. His expression sharpened. The stillness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a blade-thin edge. When he finally leaned toward the microphone, it was like watching a wall of stone crack just enough to show the heat underneath. "Cowardice in public service is contagious. I've seen better spine in interns." The words cut through the air with bitter elegance. They weren't meant for the record. They were meant for everyone. To shame, to isolate, to remind the room that loyalty to men like him wasn't optional. It was currency, and someone had just defaulted. A few heads turned. One Republican lawmaker looked down at his notes, though his hand had stopped writing minutes ago. But Jasmine didn't shift, didn't blink. She simply turned, calm, steady, and utterly unshaken. She looked Koch directly in the eyes, the way someone looks at a monument they've studied long enough to see the cracks no one else dares mention. Her voice came low and unhurried, but it rang like truth etched in steel. "And I've seen fewer strings on puppets." The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to, because everyone knew, at that moment, the hearing had turned. No longer just a reckoning of numbers or contracts, but a reckoning of who owned whom, and who finally dared to say it. The chamber had just witnessed a fracture from within, but Jasmine wasn't finished breaking the silence. Her next witness wasn't a politician or a lawyer or a data analyst. She was something rarer in Washington, a victim with nothing left to lose. Aides opened the side door, and into the marble hearing room stepped a woman who did not look like she belonged, precisely because she did. Nora Jefferson wore no blazer, no pearls, no partisan badge. She wore a faded blue work shirt, sun-wrinkled skin, and decades of quiet strength. Her boots made no sound on the floor as she walked to the witness table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as though holding back more than just nerves. Jasmine stood beside her, not as a politician now, but as a bridge. The room stilled as Nora adjusted the microphone, voice trembling just enough to remind everyone this wasn't rehearsed. "My name is Nora Jefferson. I live in Chambers County, Texas. Lived there my whole life. My land was my father's and his father's before him. It's where we raised cattle, harvested pecans, and buried our dead. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. 2 years ago, I was told a pipeline was coming. I wasn't asked, I was told. And when I pushed back, someone from a law firm came to my porch and offered me a number on a piece of paper. I didn't sign. The slide changed. A satellite image appeared. Her land, dissected by scarred lines of freshly disturbed earth. Jasmine clicked again, and legal paperwork filled the screen. Koch Midstream Development, LLC, the top line read. The room watched in silence as Nora continued. Weeks later, trucks showed up. Bulldozers followed. I called every number they gave me. No one answered. I filed complaints. I was told it was permitted activity. Her voice dropped lower. They dug through my family's graveyard. They cut the roots of trees that had been there since before I was born. Some members of the committee shifted uncomfortably. One staffer looked away, but Nora's eyes stayed forward. 3 nights ago, a man in a suit came to my property again. This time he brought papers, said I could still get a check, said I just had to sign something first, a non-disclosure agreement, said it was for everyone's protection. I asked him whose protection he meant. He didn't answer. For a moment, no one moved. The story wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't policy. It was pain, delivered without anger, only the exhaustion of someone whose truth had been ignored for too long. Jasmine placed a hand on the edge of the witness table, steady but firm, then turned to the defense side of the room. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. Mr. Koch, she said without raising it, would you care to respond? Charles Koch leaned into his microphone with an ease that betrayed no emotion. His posture didn't shift, nor did his expression. It was the voice of someone who had made this kind of damage routine. She was compensated, fairly. The words hung in the air, not as a rebuttal, but as a dismissal, as if land, memory, and dignity could be filed under cost of business, as if silence could be bought in acres and easements. The line between arrogance and sociopathy thinned. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She reached into the folder beside her, pulled out a single document, and held it up. Her voice was steady but laced with steel. Then explain why your lawyer visited her the day before, with a non-disclosure and a threat. The page behind her appeared on the screen. Letterhead from a Koch-aligned firm. A signed statement offering compensation contingent upon silence. A highlighted clause that read, recipient shall not disclose nature, location, or details of interaction. Gasps erupted, not from Jasmine's side of the aisle, but from the audience gallery. Reporters tapped furiously. One committee member whispered to another, eyes wide. Koch remained still, but his jaw tensed just enough for the cameras to catch it. He said nothing. Jasmine didn't need him to. She let the paper speak. Let Nora's story speak. Let the silence speak. Because in that moment, the lie wasn't what Koch said. It was what he refused to answer. And the whole country was watching. The hearing room had absorbed hours of testimony, evidence, and controlled fury, but none of it had bent Jasmine. Koch's legal team, sensing the shift in momentum, didn't reach for facts. They reached for the one thing powerful men have always reached for when the walls begin to crack. Discredit the woman holding the hammer. Without warning, the screen behind Jasmine flickered again. Not a document this time, but video. Grainy footage played on the monitors, clearly clipped from a town hall event held years earlier. Jasmine appeared at a podium in a small community center, surrounded by folding chairs and neighbors, not cameras. Her voice, passionate, unapologetic, rang out over the faint hum of poor audio. Capitalism without conscience is just control, she said, and I'm not here to protect power. I'm here to question it. Her words, taken from a broader speech on corporate tax avoidance and rural job losses, were now being weaponized without context, flattened into a soundbite. As the clip ended, there was a calculated pause, long enough to let the distortion settle. Then, with the same cool detachment used to introduce exhibits, a Koch attorney leaned into the mic. For the record, this video speaks to Representative Crockett's pattern of anti-business rhetoric. The implication was clear. The facts she'd presented were no longer what mattered. Now she was on trial. A Republican congressman well known for his ties to energy PACs used the opening. "Mr. Chairman," he began, "I move that Representative Crockett be recused from further questioning. Her history of inflammatory rhetoric against American business disqualifies her objectivity in these proceedings." It was smooth, rehearsed, delivered without a hint of irony. The kind of move made not in pursuit of truth, but in defense of the structure that truth threatened to collapse. Jasmine sat in silence, the camera lingering on her profile. She didn't respond. Not yet, because she knew the room. She knew this tactic. When they couldn't disprove your facts, they went after your tone. When they couldn't refute your evidence, they questioned your character. Then Charles Koch leaned forward, not to argue, not to deny, but to label. His voice was calm, almost affable, like a man reading a verdict he wrote himself. "Even radicals get their stage in today's America." The smile that followed was faint, but intentional. He wasn't defending himself. He was defining her, and in doing so, trying to remind the room who still held the pen. But he'd forgotten who was still holding the mic. Jasmine stood, not abruptly, not emotionally, but with the grounded steadiness of someone who had walked through worse fires to get here. She didn't look at the man who moved to silence her. She didn't look at the video still frozen on screen. She looked directly at Koch, letting the silence between them become its own kind of confrontation. When she spoke, her words weren't loud, but they landed with the weight of everything she'd endured just to stand in that room. "You call it radical. I call it clean hands." The words cut through the air like a quiet verdict, not just for Koch, but for every person watching who knew what it meant to be vilified for speaking when silence would have been safer. She wasn't defending herself. She was reclaiming the truth, reclaiming the narrative, because in a chamber where power expected her to fold, she had brought something they hadn't planned for: conviction without a price tag. And for the first time all day, no one tried to interrupt her. The smear attempt had failed, and the room had begun to tilt back toward Jasmine, truth slowly reclaiming ground from spectacle. But what came next didn't just shift the momentum, it detonated it. Without a word, one of the House investigators rose from his seat behind Jasmine and leaned down, slipping a small black USB into her hand. There was no announcement, no sidebar, no warning, just a flash of understanding between colleagues. Jasmine nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then turned back to the panel. "Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to enter into the record a new piece of audio evidence submitted by an anonymous federal source this morning," she said, her voice even. "It contains excerpts from a closed-door strategy session held in Clearwater, Florida, with Mr. Koch and senior policy consultants." The chairman blinked, taken aback, but nodded. The clerk took the USB and plugged it into the chamber's central console. The screen behind the witness table darkened, then flashed blue. A timestamp appeared in the top corner. March 3rd, 2024, 9:17 a.m. The audio began with the clinking of silverware, muted voices, and then a man's voice. Clear, unmistakable. Koch's voice. "Lobbying's outdated," the voice said casually, like someone explaining the weather. "We don't pass laws, we buy the people who do." A wave of gasps swept the room like a rolling shockwave. One aide dropped his pen. A senator whispered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. The phrase wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't theoretical. It was admission. And not the kind whispered in private. This was strategy vocalized with confidence, because the man who said it had never been held accountable for speaking the truth out loud, until now. Koch exploded out of his chair. The transformation was instant. No longer the composed executive playing chess with policy, but a man cornered, teeth bared. His voice boomed through the chamber before the clip had even finished playing. "That audio is illegal, stolen property," he shouted, fists clenched at his sides. "You have no authorization to play that. None. This violates federal wiretap statutes, and I will see to it that every member of this committee is investigated for this breach." The room wasn't used to seeing him uncomposed. That alone struck like a revelation. For the first time, the man who had treated the proceedings like an inconvenience looked like someone afraid. But Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch, didn't even move from where she stood. She simply let the outburst burn out like a match held too long, and then, like she'd been waiting her entire life for that exact line, she stepped forward and said with brutal clarity, "So is the democracy you tried to purchase." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was charged. Every word she said carried weight, and now the entire chamber could feel it pressing down, not as rhetoric, as reckoning. Coke froze mid-step. There was nothing left to pivot toward. No op-ed, no legal clause, no dollar figure that could absorb what had just been said and proven. Jasmine didn't continue. She didn't need to. The room was already shifting, and not just inside the Capitol. Phones vibrated along desks. Reporters stared, blinking, as if their screens had stopped functioning. Outside the building, alerts had already hit the newswire. A billionaire had admitted what the public had suspected for years, and a woman with no wealth to protect, only her integrity, had made the country hear it. She didn't smile. She just waited. Because from here on, he would be the one answering questions. The chamber, still reverberating from the weight of Jasmine's final blow, now entered a silence more piercing than outrage. It wasn't the stillness of confusion. It was the silence before judgment, the kind that makes men shift in their chairs and breathe just a little too carefully. Every face in the room had changed. Staffers sat upright with held pens. Journalists leaned forward without blinking, and lawmakers glanced sideways. Not at the evidence, which now needed no interpretation, but at each other. The truth was no longer in dispute. Now the question was what this body would do about it. The chairman, normally dry and procedural, took a longer pause than usual before he spoke. His fingers tapped once on the desk before lifting the mic. "Given the gravity of the testimony and the evidence submitted into the record," he began, his voice slow, deliberate, "this committee will proceed to an immediate vote. The motion is as follows. Shall the findings of this hearing, including all submitted exhibits, testimony, and recordings, be formally transferred to the Department of Justice for potential criminal investigation into Koch Industries and affiliated entities?" He didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't need to. He looked straight ahead as if trying to level the weight of law across the room. A ripple of movement followed. Small envelopes distributed, pens scribbling silently, hands folding paper like verdicts. The room's air felt denser with each passing second, not loud but loaded. Some lawmakers hesitated, glancing toward Koch, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of fear. But Koch offered no signal. For once, he had no script left to hand them. He leaned forward instead, no longer draped in casual control but wrapped in something colder. Calculation, laced with fury just beneath the skin. When he finally spoke, it was with the sharpened tone of a man used to framing the moment before it framed him. "You're not punishing crime. You're punishing power you fear." His voice was calm, too calm. A line not just meant to be heard, but remembered, as if one final brand on the room before history rewrote the hierarchy. There was no outburst, no denial, just a reframing, one last attempt to stand above the law by pretending it never applied to him in the first place. But Jasmine stood, not to defend herself, not to respond out of ego. She stood because silence, in the presence of that kind of audacity, was not an option. She had sat through hours of evasion, condescension, dismissal. She had been called radical, accused of bias, and now she was being told that what she had done wasn't courage, but fear. And she answered not with volume, but with precision. Not with emotion, but with truth honed to a blade. If that power poisons the Republic, then yes, consider me its antidote. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The line cut clean through the room like steel through silk. Everyone heard it. Everyone felt it. And for a moment, even Koch, still clutching the edge of his carefully crafted persona, showed something else in his eyes. Not anger, not confidence, but the sharp, flickering glint of recognition. The chairman broke the silence. One nod to the clerk, one motion to tally the votes. The process was clinical, but no one could pretend it was routine. The envelope count moved from hand to hand like sacred evidence. The numbers were entered, double-checked. Time seemed to slow, then snapped back into motion as the chairman leaned into his mic one final time. By a vote of 10-3, the motion passes. The matter will be referred to the Department of Justice for formal criminal investigation. No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment, because everyone in that room, friend, opponent, silent observer, understood what had just occurred. A line had been crossed, not by accident, but by design. And for once, the system didn't protect the man who built the shortcut. It moved to hold him accountable. Coke remained still, hands folded, face tight. No more comments, no more smirks. The performance was over. And Jasmine? She didn't lean back with satisfaction or take a victory lap with her eyes. She sat down quietly, finally, as if releasing the weight of every hearing she'd ever walked into where the truth wasn't enough. This time, it had been. She didn't look for applause. She looked straight ahead. Because this wasn't a win. It was a beginning. The vote had landed like a gavel across an empire. But no one moved. Not yet. The room sat with the verdict, feeling its weight in the air like smoke after a fire. But all eyes slowly turned to one man, and for the first time all day, Charles Coke was no longer the one watching. He was the one being watched. Charles Coke rose from his seat with the practiced precision of a man who had never left a room defeated. But this time, the mask had slipped, just slightly, just enough. His spine was still straight, his tailored suit still perfect. But there was something new in his expression. Not panic, not collapse, but the unmistakable flicker of true fury. His eyes, for hours impassive behind moneyed indifference, now burned with something more raw, contempt wrapped in disbelief. The empire he'd built on quiet deals and faceless influence had for the first time been dragged into the daylight and stripped of its myth. He reached for his cane, not because he needed it, but because it gave the illusion of control. Each step toward the exit was heavy with the awareness that this hearing, this room, this woman had pierced something he had thought untouchable. Aides moved to flank him, but he waved them off with a slight shake of his head. His pride wasn't in the evidence. It was in never reacting. And now even that was beginning to slip. At the threshold, just before crossing into the hallway beyond the cameras, he stopped. Slowly he turned back. Not to the committee, not to the audience, but to Jasmine. His voice, still calm, held the sharp edge of a man clinging to the illusion of control. "This isn't over," he said, words measured like a threat carved into marble. "Empires don't fall in a day." It was a sentence that carried the weight of decades. It wasn't just a farewell, it was a warning. A man who had purchased policy, sculpted law, and silenced opposition didn't believe in endings. He believed in delays, in leverage, in long games. His legacy had always been built not on victories, but on the quiet postponement of consequences. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't rise to meet the moment. She didn't dignify his final turn with theatrical confrontation. Instead, she remained seated, facing forward, her gaze resting somewhere beyond him. On the work that still remained, on the system still gasping for accountability. And when she finally spoke, it was not to Charles Coke as a man, but to everything he represented. "They do when the foundation is rot." The sentence wasn't loud, but it landed like a tremor. Deep, steady, irreversible. It didn't need applause. It didn't ask for reaction, because it wasn't about winning an argument. It was about speaking a truth that could no longer be buried beneath money, titles, or time. Coke blinked once, the faintest twitch of his jaw betraying the impact, then turned and disappeared through the doors. This time, he exited to silence. The cameras followed him for a breath, then pivoted back to the witness table. But Jasmine wasn't done. She sat for a moment longer, letting the air settle, letting the moment breathe. Then slowly, deliberately, she stood. The room was still full, but somehow it felt smaller now, as though the absence of Coke had removed a pressure the room hadn't realized it was holding. Her eyes scanned the panel, the aides, the press gallery, but then she turned not to them, not even to the chairman, but directly to the lens of the nearest camera, to the millions watching, to the ones who had been told that wealth equaled truth and silence was wisdom. Her voice was low, steady, clear. You can drown truth in money, but it floats. Every single time. The words were not for the record. They were not for Coke. They were for every young staffer sitting behind a railing, every voter who'd stopped believing anything in D.C. could still shock them, every whistleblower who'd never hit send. She wasn't just closing the hearing. She was opening something bigger, a reckoning that had already begun and would not end when the doors shut. In the pause that followed, no one dared move. It was not out of fear but reverence, not for her position, but for the clarity of what she had just done. She had pulled the curtain back on the oldest performance in American politics. That money was power, and power meant impunity. And she had done it without shouting, without posturing, with nothing more than facts, patience, and an unshakable sense of justice. Behind her, aides began packing up files. Reporters scrambled for last quotes. Security signaled to escort committee members out. But Jasmine stayed in place for just a moment longer, eyes still fixed on the lens. Not in search of approval, but to bear witness. Then quietly, without flourish, she turned and walked away. She didn't leave the room victorious. She left it unchanged. But now, for the first time in decades, that room would never feel the same again. The moment the chairman read the vote aloud, something in the country shifted, not just in Washington, but in the air between people who had long since given up on expecting accountability. It wasn't a riot of celebration, and it wasn't disbelief either. It was stillness, heavy, electric, like the pause between thunder and the realization that the sky has cracked open. Outside the hearing room, reporters scrambled. Microphones were raised mid-sentence. Producers screamed in earpieces, "Cut to live! Cut now!" Within 60 seconds, the alert hit every screen in the country. Congress refers Coke for criminal investigation in landmark vote, 10-3. But it wasn't the vote that held America's breath. It was what came before. The moment they all heard Charles Koch's voice, clear as a confession, say, "We don't pass laws. We buy the people who do." That sentence burned through the media cycle like acid. It looped on every news channel, played in every airport, appeared in TikTok videos with subtitles and in reels layered over orchestral music. It didn't matter what your politics were. It didn't matter if you even knew who Koch was. You heard that sentence and for once, didn't wonder if the system was rigged. You knew, because the man who rigged it had said it out loud. Social media detonated. Within 30 minutes, Koch tapes trended in 24 countries. By noon, the top 5 global hashtags included clean hands, truth floats, and you be the people who do. But this wasn't just virality, it was velocity. People didn't just share, they remembered. They started pulling receipts. Archived tweets of lobbying records resurfaced. Screenshots of campaign contributions connected to Koch-backed PACS reappeared. Users cross-referenced state policies with corporate tax breaks. Reddit threads filled with timelines, side-by-side comparisons, and receipts. Jasmine's quote, "You can drown truth in money, but it floats every single time," was turned into posters, graffiti, digital illustrations, and protest banners within hours. At a community college in Minnesota, a government teacher played the final moments of the hearing for his class. A 16-year-old girl in the back of the room raised her hand and said, "So, she won?" "No," the professor said, closing his laptop. "She exposed," and the room was quiet. Cable news tried to keep up. Analysts scrambled to reframe it, some calling it Watergate for the new age, others warning it could set a dangerous precedent against free enterprise. But the public wasn't listening to spin anymore. They had heard something too clear, too raw, too real to be softened. It wasn't theory, it wasn't hyperbole, it was recorded. In campaign headquarters across the country, aides scrambled. Some frantically reviewed old donor lists. Others revised press releases in real time. One high-level advisor to a prominent swing state senator was overheard yelling into the phone, "Scrub everything linked to Koch. I don't care what it paid for. Bury it now." Staffers working for corporate-friendly lawmakers began tweeting carefully worded statements of support for transparency, while frantically checking if their bosses had ever been photographed shaking Koch's hand. And then came the resignation. At 5:42 p.m., Senator Alton Briggs from Montana, a two-term moderate, heavily backed by Koch's political network, posted a photo of a handwritten letter on Twitter. The message was short, and it broke the news cycle again. I didn't run for office to be someone's asset. I knew what the money meant, and I took it. I won't pretend I didn't. But I also won't pretend this isn't the line. I'm stepping down, and I'm sorry. It was signed in black ink. No press release, no talking points, just the letter. Within 15 minutes, it had been retweeted 480,000 times. Across the country, people began to gather, not in protest, but in witness. In New York, Chicago, Tulsa, and Montgomery, small groups formed at public libraries, on courthouse steps, and in parking lots near old Union halls. They didn't chant. They didn't rage. They read. People passed around printed transcripts of Jasmine Crockett's closing statement. College students pulled up the hearing on projectors in dorm lounges. Ministers began quoting her line about rot at the foundation during sermons. One preacher in Louisiana said, God doesn't let the temple collapse because of one storm. He lets it fall because you've been patching the cracks with lies. In Detroit, a mural appeared overnight. Jasmine mid-sentence, facing down a shadowy figure with strings attached to Congress people like marionettes. The caption underneath read, "Not every lobbyist funds the pen." Meanwhile, in Jasmine's office, the lights stayed on past midnight. Staffers fielded over 7,000 emails in 6 hours, some angry, some threatening, but most of them thankful. Messages poured in from teachers, veterans, single moms, union members, undocumented students, and retired civil servants. One email simply read, "You made me feel like the truth still matters." I forgot what that felt like. Jasmine didn't hold a press conference. She didn't post a victory video. She went quiet, not out of retreat, but resolve. Her team said she spent the entire night writing personal replies to the first 100 constituents who'd emailed her after the hearing. No ghostwriter, no press team, just her and a blinking cursor. Someone asked her staff the next day if she'd seen that she was trending globally. They said she hadn't looked. That's not why she did it. By the end of the week, professors had added the hearing to their syllabi. Law students were analyzing the vote for precedent. Civic education groups launched a national campaign called Know the Web to teach young voters about political influence and corporate lobbying. What Jasmine Crockett had done was more than reveal corruption. She had named it, publicly, unflinchingly, and on the record. She didn't just speak truth to power, she made power flinch. And in a democracy that had grown numb to money, that kind of clarity was more than rare. It was revolutionary. It didn't take 24 hours. The backlash came faster than anyone had expected. It was as though someone had pressed a panic button inside the machinery of American power, and every system, legal, political, and psychological, lurched into motion. Charles Koch may have walked out of the hearing visibly diminished, but his empire wasn't built for surrender. It was built for retaliation. The first counterstrike wasn't legal, it was narrative. By sunrise the next morning, a coordinated stream of op-eds flooded conservative media outlets. Jasmine Crockett was labeled reckless, radical, emotionally unstable, and, most damning of all to the traditionalist eye, a threat to congressional decorum. Syndicated columnists accused her of exploiting her identity for political spectacle. Others mocked her calm defiance as calculated aggression. On primetime cable news, grainy footage of her 2021 speech in Texas, where she criticized unchecked capitalism, was spliced next to video of shuttered small businesses and struggling veterans. The message was overt. She doesn't hate corruption, she hates America. Then came the second wave, digital disinformation, precise and overwhelming. Hundreds of bot accounts tweeted false claims that Jasmine had accepted money from the very corporations she condemned. Edited videos appeared, using AI to mimic her voice, spouting lines she never said. One viral clip showed her laughing during the hearing, a laugh that never happened. It was deepfake sleight of hand, but to the untrained eye, it was enough. Hashtags like "Warren Crockett hypocrite," clean hands Mayas, and fake justice began trending within hours. Meme factories and anonymous Telegram channels recycled the same doctored quotes with different backgrounds. Jasmine next to a hammer and sickle, Jasmine edited onto protest riots, Jasmine superimposed over burning American flags. These weren't just low blows. They were psychological warfare, aimed not just at discrediting her message, but reshaping public memory before it could fully settle. Even the language of power turned against her. At least 5 local stations in swing states ran pre-scripted news packages attacking her credibility. All featured the same copy. Congresswoman Crockett's conduct has raised concerns across party lines. Some included fake statistics, claiming that investor confidence had plummeted after her hearing. Others implied that by targeting Koch, she had endangered millions of American jobs. It was a lie, but lies travel well when they're carried by polished fonts and official-sounding narrators. And inside the Capitol, the silence began to creep in. A memo circulated behind closed doors alleging that Jasmine had compromised procedural neutrality by revealing the audio during the hearing. Several Republican lawmakers signed on to a demand for an ethics investigation, citing the inappropriate use of committee time for personal grandstanding. The accusation was baseless. It didn't matter. It was printed, quoted, aired, and repeated enough to become its own shadow truth. Even some Democrats began to waver. Privately, they praised her. Publicly, they dodged questions. "We're reviewing the full transcript," one senator said. "It was a dramatic day and tensions were high," said another. "We should be careful not to weaponize oversight," warned a third. The message was clear. She had said the quiet part out loud, and now everyone was rushing to pretend they hadn't heard it. Jasmine's staff received over 200 threatening messages in the first 48 hours. Many were anonymous, some weren't. One voicemail said she deserved to be dragged out of that chamber like the liar she is. Another, calm and chilling, warned, "People who talk like you usually don't last long in Washington." Her district office in Texas received a suspicious envelope, later cleared by Capitol Police. Right-wing blogs ran a story claiming her law license was under emergency review. It wasn't, but that didn't stop the story from reaching nearly 500,000 shares. One national outlet ran a headline that summed up the double standard perfectly. "Crockett under fire, hero or headache." In just 4 words, it rewrote the narrative from truth-teller to political inconvenience. Behind the scenes, lobbyists moved swiftly. PACs aligned with Koch's network launched a new Restoring Civility initiative, thinly veiled opposition to any politician willing to expose corporate influence. Vulnerable House members were offered campaign boosts if they publicly condemned personal attacks and oversight. Policy language began circulating that would limit the type of evidence admissible in future hearings. They couldn't erase what happened, but they could make sure it never happened again. And through it all, Jasmine remained visible. Calm, unapologetic. She held a single press conference, no stagecraft, no slogans. Just her, a podium, and a row of reporters expecting fury. What they got instead was fire under glass. "If telling the truth makes me the target," she said, her voice steady, "then you're showing America exactly how power protects itself. And I'm not afraid of that. I'm accountable to the people, not to the donors who hide behind curtains." Her words weren't a defense. They were a dare. The following day, she returned to the House floor for a routine subcommittee vote. Every camera tracked her like a hawk. Opponents expected her to flinch. Some allies expected her to soften. But Jasmine didn't blink. She voted. She spoke. She walked the halls like someone who'd already survived what they were threatening her with. And that's what scared them most. Because the story wasn't just that she'd exposed Koch. It was that she'd endured the machine's full weight and kept standing. The backlash hadn't silenced her. It had revealed them. And deep inside the system, the ones who understood that the most weren't the loudest voices on TV or the faceless accounts online. It was the ones behind closed doors, with their fingers on the levers of influence, realizing too late that Jasmine Crockett wasn't playing to win a headline. She was playing to make sure the next one who came after her wouldn't have to fight just to tell the truth. At first it was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows shock, the kind of quiet Jasmine Crockett had seen before. When people are told they shouldn't feel what they feel, that they imagine the injustice, that power didn't just rig the game, it rewrote the rules, then gaslit the nation into thinking the outcome was fair. But the silence didn't last, because this time, the people had heard everything. They had seen Coke say the part that was never supposed to be said. They had watched Jasmine not only survive the machine, but name it, dismantle it, and walk through the smoke with her head high. And once people hear truth spoken clearly, unapologetically, and under oath, they don't forget it. The first ripple came in Atlanta, where a group of high school students, too young to vote but old enough to understand what it means to be shut out, organized a sidewalk teach-in. They brought laptops and speakers and played the hearing on repeat during their lunch period. One student held a cardboard sign that read, "I want a government I don't have to decode." By the next day, similar gatherings had sprung up in Denver, Philadelphia, Phoenix, and Louisville. College students printed out Jasmine's quote, "You can drown truth in money, but it floats every single time," and wheat pasted it on dorm walls. Activists turned it into projection art on the side of federal courthouses. Teachers handed out the hearing transcript in civics class. A retired Marine in North Carolina recorded a message on his phone. "Jasmine Crockett spoke more truth in 30 minutes than I've heard from Congress in 30 years. She stood up. Now it's our turn." And people did stand up. In Oklahoma, a Native Women's Coalition invoked Jasmine's testimony during a land sovereignty protest, linking Koch-funded pipeline policies to the erasure of tribal rights. In Minneapolis, a clergy-led vigil lit candles for integrity and leadership, and ended not in prayer, but with every participant reading her full closing line in unison. If that power poisons the republic, then yes, consider me its antidote. It wasn't just about Coke anymore. It was about all of it. The bought silence, the distorted truths, the disconnection so many Americans had come to accept as unchangeable. Jasmine had made the invisible visible, and now people couldn't unsee it. In Mississippi, a black farming cooperative published a full-page open letter in their local paper. It read, "For decades, people like us have watched people like Coke build power by making sure voices like ours stayed out of the room. Jasmine Crockett brought us back in." Donations flooded into local grassroots organizations, voting access groups, media literacy projects, anti-corruption watchdogs. But not just in blue states. In Nebraska, a group of veterans organized a truth march and invited everyone, Democrat, Republican, Independent. One of the organizers said, "This isn't left or right. This is about whether we let billionaires own the rules." On TikTok, the movement took on a new language. Young creators spliced Jasmine's responses with imagery from films, anime, and real-life protests. One video, set to swelling orchestral music, juxtaposed her quote, "Not every lobbyist funds the pen and decides the ink," with images of landmark civil rights moments. In under 48 hours, it hit 12 million views. Then came the letters. In the evening, Jasmine's office received over 50,000 in a week. Handwritten notes, postcards, long confessions typed in courier font from people who had never written to a lawmaker before. One was from a coal worker in West Virginia. "I don't agree with all your politics, but you said what needed saying. That takes guts. And maybe if more of y'all had guts, we'd trust this damn place again." Another came from a 13-year-old girl in San Bernardino. "My teacher showed us what you said. I never thought someone like me could talk like that and not get silenced. Now I want to be in Congress one day too." The momentum became movement. By the second week, organizers from across the country launched an independent initiative, the Clean Hands Coalition, named for Jasmine's now iconic line. Their mission was simple: support public servants who prioritize people over profit and call out those who don't. Within days, they had over 200 local chapters and a digital toolkit downloaded 70,000 times. Their slogan? "Truth floats. We rise with it." Jasmine never asked for this. She had expected the backlash, but she had never expected the awakening. When a reporter finally asked her if she thought she had started a movement, she replied simply, "No, I just said what we've all been thinking." The movement started the moment people realized they're not crazy for seeing what's always been there. The machine tried to discredit her, But the people answered. The machine tried to isolate her, but the people echoed her words louder than any ad campaign could. The machine tried to bury her truth, but it forgot. Truth floats. And this time, it didn't just float, it carried millions with it. The crowds didn't stay forever. The hashtags faded, as they always do. The cameras packed up. The halls of Congress fell quiet again. But beneath the noise, something deeper remained, something Jasmine never intended to ignite, but now carried with her. Not just a movement, a lesson. You don't walk through fire and come out the same, not even when you win. Jasmine knew this. She didn't leave that hearing room feeling triumphant. She left it heavier, because behind every question she asked, every piece of evidence she revealed, there had been a risk that no one would care, that it would vanish like so many truths before it. But they did care, and now, after the votes, the backlash, the national wave of support, came the hardest part. Living in the space between justice and its absence. The first thing she learned was this: you can survive the system and still be scarred by it. Weeks after the hearing, she sat alone in her office late at night, sorting through letters by hand. Most of them were hopeful, but some were hateful, surgical in their cruelty. One in particular ended with the words, "Your truth doesn't change how the world works." She stared at that line, not in fear, but in recognition, because it was the echo of something she had always known deep down. Truth doesn't fix injustice. It forces you to choose what you'll do in its light. The lesson wasn't that the system is corrupt. That wasn't news. The lesson was how fast the system fights back when it's forced to look in the mirror. She learned that when you speak clearly, they don't argue facts. They attack your motives, your tone, your skin, your gender. They'll pretend you're angry when you're calm, radical when you're rational, dangerous when you're simply clear. Jasmine hadn't yelled. She hadn't cursed. She had asked for accountability, and that had been treated like a revolution. But the deeper truth, the one that settled into her bones, was this: power doesn't fear exposure. It fears resilience. You can call out corruption. You can even prove it. But unless you endure the smear, the silence, the slow turning of former allies, the truth dies on the floor where you spoke it. Jasmine had seen it happen to others: activists, whistleblowers, colleagues who raised the alarm and were left standing alone. She had promised herself she would not flinch when it came for her, and she hadn't. But it cost her. It cost her sleep. It cost her safety. It cost her the comfort of being liked in rooms that once applauded her poise. One colleague even pulled her aside and said, "You're right, but you're radioactive now. Be careful." Jasmine didn't answer him, because how do you explain that the risk of silence had grown louder than the risk of speaking? She learned something else too, something slower, more sacred. Truth alone doesn't change people, but courage makes them look. In the weeks after the hearing, she began to meet people who said her words had cracked something open in them. A firefighter in Ohio who'd stopped voting 10 years ago. A teacher in Kentucky who now opened every civics class with her closing statement. A father in Detroit who said his daughter memorized Jasmine's lines like poetry. And none of them asked her for policy. They didn't want promises. They wanted permission to believe again. That was the lesson. That even if justice isn't instant, dignity is. That even when the system bends away from you, your spine doesn't have to. Jasmine realized she hadn't just called out a billionaire. She'd given ordinary people a map out of the fog. She had proven that you don't need to raise your voice to shake a room. You just need to say what others are afraid to say and refuse to apologize when they try to shame you for it. The lesson had been learned, etched not just into the history books, but into the hearts of a nation waiting for someone to say what they'd always known. But Jasmine understood that truth without action is just memory, and she wasn't here to be remembered. She was here to move the ground beneath them. So she stood again, this time not in a hearing room, not behind closed doors, but in front of a crowd that stretched beyond the steps of Capitol Hill. The sun hit her face, but her voice was the sharper light. "They wanted this to be the end," she began, her tone calm but cutting. "But I'm not interested in symbolism. I'm interested in consequence." She scanned the sea of faces, veterans, teachers, nurses, students, truck drivers, parents who'd stopped believing change was possible. And then she said it. Don't wait for heroes. Become unignorable. This was no campaign speech. It was an ultimatum. Jasmine didn't ask for applause. She asked for pressure. If you've ever felt small in the face of power, now is your moment to reclaim that space. Show up. Vote like your voice is a weapon, because it is. Organize like democracy depends on your kitchen table, because it does. And speak even when your voice shakes, especially then. She pointed not to herself, but to the Capitol behind her. That building doesn't belong to billionaires. It belongs to you. And they're counting on you for getting that. The crowd didn't erupt. They locked in, because they knew this wasn't theater. This was a countdown. Jasmine's final words echoed off the marble columns and into the veins of every person listening. We don't need permission to hold power accountable. We just need each other. So let's start. And the air didn't just shift. It charged. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.